"Get that black girl off the stage." Those were the words of a renowned pianist aimed at a blind black girl with a deep passion for music. Her name was Zariah, but to that man she was nothing more than a blind black child, someone he believed could never do anything, someone he thought didn't deserve to touch a single piano key on that prestigious stage. What he didn't know was that the very girl he looked down on was in fact a genius, one of the rarest musical talents the world would ever witness. The moment her fingers touched the keys, not only the pianist, but everyone in that hall was struck with shame and regret for the prejudices they had held. Before we continue, I would like to know where in the world you are watching this story from. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on inspiring and impactful stories like this one. The concert hall at Crown Ridge Conservatory was hushed, glowing under the golden spill of chandelier light. Crystal chandeliers swung slightly in the air-conditioned stillness, their soft clinks echoing like tiny nervous breaths. Every velvet seat in the hall was filled elite patrons, donors, visiting alumni, and a few hand-picked students, each one dressed in dark, expensive fabrics and the silence of status. They were there for the pre-show of the Crown Ridge Winter Gala, a private rehearsal open only to the most exclusive guests. Then the clicking began, soft, uncertain echoing through the marble floor. Click, click, closer now. At first, no one turned, until the silhouette stepped into the spotlight and the room went still. She looked small, too small for the room, too still for the tension in the air. And then came Zariah Cole. 15 years old, skin like deep earth hair braided into neat rows, each one tight and perfect, like she had done it herself that morning. Her dress was simple navy blue cotton with a frayed hem, and her shoes made no sound as she walked. She held a white cane in her right hand. Yes, her eyes were damaged. She was blind. Her left hand trembled slightly at her side, not from fear, but from something else. She had simply asked moments earlier in a quiet voice from behind the curtain, "May I touch the keys?" That was all. She didn't ask to play. She didn't demand attention. She just wanted to feel them. 1 second of closeness to the instrument that had consumed every inch of her imagination since she first heard its sound. 1 touch. But the moment she entered the light, the temperature in the room shifted. A voice cut through the air like a blade. "Take her off the stage," it echoed. Sharp, loud, unapologetic. "She's blind. She'll scratch the damn keys," gasps. Soft, scattered, but real. The crowd of guests, donors, alumni, professors turned their heads like a flock of birds sensing danger. Some of them chuckled awkwardly, some winced, others looked away, completely suddenly fascinated with the programs in their laps. Zariah froze. Her left hand gripped her cane. Her right hand hovered just inches above the glossy surface of the Yamaha CFX Grand. She didn't speak. She didn't move. Her chin was lifted slightly, as if listening to the echo of her own shame bounce off the marble walls. Lionel Hargrave stormed forward from the first row. The man was an institution, a legend. He had played for presidents, for kings. His posture was perfect, like a man carved into his own myth. Salt and pepper hair swept back like a blade. Thin-rimmed glasses, black tuxedo, a gold lapel pin glinting like judgment. He raised a finger at her as if pointing at a dog that had soiled his rug. "She doesn't belong on that bench," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is not a school for pity performances. She's blind, for heaven's sake. She'll damage the Steinway." A voice from offstage stammered, "Sir, she didn't ask to perform. Just to—" "I don't care," Hargrave barked. "You don't let a child play in traffic just because she wants to drive." The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was sticky, uncomfortable, the kind of silence that wrapped around your throat when someone says something cruel in public and you don't know what to do about it. A woman in the third row shifted in her seat. A student near the back dropped a pen. Somewhere, someone started to clap nervously, then stopped. Zariah didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. But her breathing changed. Her shoulders were still, but her nostrils flared slightly, barely, but enough to signal what was happening beneath the surface. A war. One part of her wanted to scream, to spit venom, to break something, to say, "I am more than what you see." The other part, stronger, colder, told her, "Don't give them that. Don't feed their story. Let them wonder what you could have said." So she stayed still. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry, just that. No more." Her voice floated barely above a whisper, but clear. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defeat. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that makes some people uncomfortable because they can't bully you into exploding. Hargrave turned away with a scoff like she'd wasted his time. But a man near the wall, someone no one noticed, raised his phone pretending to check messages. His thumb hit record, not because he meant to capture anything, but because the stillness of the girl, the eerie control in her expression, made him feel like he was standing at the edge of something bigger. Zariah backed away from the piano, 1 foot at a time, cane tapping, not hurried, not ashamed, just quiet. She didn't bow. She didn't glance at Hargrave again. Her hand brushed against the curtain as she disappeared backstage. And just like that, she was gone. Behind the curtain, the air was stale. She found an empty chair and sat. Her hands trembled now, not out of fear, but the effort of holding it all in, of being calm when her body wanted to break. Why did you do that? She asked herself. Why did you even ask? You knew how this place works. But deeper still, another voice whispered, because I needed to. Because silence can't learn if it never dares to speak. People say time slows down in moments of public humiliation. It doesn't. It becomes sharper. Every sound slices deeper. Every breath feels staged. You notice details you wish you hadn't, like the way someone looked at you like a stray animal, or the smirk on a teenage pianist's face in the third row. It stays with you. And as Zariah sat there breathing quietly, she wasn't thinking about the piano. She was thinking about how people like Hargrave exist in every system, loud, untouchable, always right. How many doors had closed before she even got to knock out in the audience? The energy didn't bounce back. No one spoke much during intermission. And later, when someone asked Hargrave if he'd overreacted, he waved the question away like smoke. She's a blind girl. She needs supervision, not stages. But some people didn't forget. Because everyone has seen that moment on a bus, in a classroom, at a job interview, when someone who should have had a chance is pushed aside. And deep down, everyone remembers how it felt to be Zariah, to be underestimated, to be erased before you even spoke, to be told with a laugh or a scoff or a condescending pat on the shoulder, you don't belong here. But here's the thing they didn't see that day. She wasn't walking away because she lost. She was walking away because one day they were going to listen. And when they did, it wouldn't be because she screamed. It would be because she played one note and made the world hold its breath. The hallway outside room 2C always smelled like old varnish and wet stone at 7:15 a.m. It was still dark outside, and most of the students at Crown Ridge Conservatory were still in bed or sipping cappuccinos in the student lounge. But Zariah was already there on the floor back against the wall, fingers moving slowly in the air. She sat cross-legged, right hand raised, drawing invisible keys from memory, tracing them note by note like Braille on empty air. No one noticed her. That was the rule at Crown Ridge. You only noticed the names carved into the honor plaques. You only nodded at students whose last names appeared in musical journals or whose parents sponsored the scholarship galas. Zariah Cole had no such lineage. She was admitted under a silent observership, a bureaucratic phrase that meant, you can sit here. You can breathe our air, but don't touch anything. No studio time, no instructors, no performance opportunities, just space to absorb inspiration, as the official letter said. Her first day, a receptionist gave her a map of the building and a key card that didn't open a single door. She'd been dropped off at the front steps by a city van. A social worker in a gray wool coat had handed her one suitcase, and a box of administrative forms patted her shoulder and said, just try to stay out of trouble. Then they were gone. It didn't take long for her to learn the rhythms of the building, which practice rooms had faulty locks, which stairwells vibrated when someone was rehearsing upstairs, which professors always left their doors ajar. Every day she sat outside Professor Franklin Dare's theory class, not because she understood the lecture, not yet, but because his voice didn't sound like it wanted to impress the room. It sounded like it wanted to explain something deeper. And Zariah, though blind, broke, and invisible, was always listening. One Thursday afternoon, it was raining hard. The kind of rain that slapped against the conservatory's vaulted glass roof in waves. Rehearsals were canceled. Most students had gone home early, but Zariah was still there, sitting in her usual spot. Inside, Professor Dare was erasing the board, humming something under his breath. When he turned off the lights and opened the door to leave, he almost stepped over her. Jesus, he muttered, startled. You scared me. She turned her face upward. Sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to. Are you mimicking my lecture? I was trying, she admitted. I know I'm not supposed to be here. He didn't answer right away. He stared at her hands. They were still raised mid-air, frozen in the shape of a chord she'd tried to copy. Her eyes were closed, not timid, just focused. Why her voice cracked just slightly? Because the music makes sense, even when the world doesn't. Dare stepped closer. The hallway buzzed with fluorescent lights. His expression softened, not out of pity, but recognition. "You've been sitting outside my class for how long?" "3 months. You take notes. I remember things." He tilted his head, then knelt down slowly, setting his briefcase beside him. "Play a G7 suspended fourth," he said gently. She paused. Her lips moved as if she were counting something in her head. Then she pressed her fingers against her thigh in a sequence, left hand, then right. Silent. He waited. "I think I have it," she said. Now a diminished F. She tried again, tapping against her arm. He exhaled through his nose. "Don't be sorry," he murmured. "Be precise." That was the beginning. He didn't make an announcement, didn't notify administration. Every Thursday evening when his lectures ended and the corridors emptied, Professor Dare stayed behind. At first, he taught her by touch. He would guide her fingers over a wooden block shaped like a keyboard. "This is weight," he said, once pressing her finger down. And this, he tapped a rhythm into her wrist, is breath. He never called them lessons. She never called him sir. But together they found a language that made room for both of them. Still, Zaria knew the rules hadn't changed. Every time she heard other students laughing in the main atrium, dressed in designer coats, texting parents who owned galleries or orchestras, she felt herself shrinking again. Her clothes were always slightly damp in winter. Her lunch was packed by the shelter kitchen 2 blocks away. Her Braille reader was cracked, half functioning. Some days it didn't turn on at all. Once she overheard 2 girls whispering in the common room. She just sits there, like she thinks she belongs. She's not even in our division. Freak. She didn't respond. But that night she stayed up, tracing arpeggios into the wooden floorboards of her dorm with her fingertips until her skin went raw. One afternoon she asked Professor Dare, "Do you ever feel like, no matter how hard you try, some rooms weren't built for you?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with a kind of weary affection. Then he said, "That's why you build your own music, so they can't close the door without hearing you play from the hallway." Zaria nodded but said nothing, because deep down she still wondered if her sound, her story would ever be enough to knock. It was still dark when Zaria arrived, the kind of dark that makes fluorescent hallway lights look cruel, cold, unforgiving. She checked the time again, 6:12 a.m. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold. She hadn't eaten yet. She hadn't slept well. Franklin had called her twice the night before to remind her, no matter what happens tomorrow morning, you show up. That's the win. Her audition slot for the Virtuoso Showcase had been scheduled for 6:30 a.m., the earliest of any student. There'd been no announcement, no program, just a quiet email forwarded from Franklin candidate Cole report to rehearsal room B7. When she walked in, the room was barely lit. No banners, no nameplates, no sound tech. Just a piano pushed against the far wall, the old Yamaha upright, not the concert Steinway, from the main hall. Its surface was dulled with fingerprints and time. 2 of the keys had visible discoloration, and the left pedal stuck when pressed. She'd played better instruments in the community shelter. A man in a gray cardigan sat on a folding chair about 20 feet away. He didn't introduce himself. He barely looked up. He clicked his pen twice, then said, "Whenever you're ready." Zaria nodded once. She felt for the bench, sat down, and adjusted herself carefully. Her fingers hovered over the keys, stretching wide, remembering the width of octaves, the spacing between chords. She didn't ask for a warm-up. She didn't ask if they were ready. She took a slow breath and began. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, from memory. No sheet music, no conductor, just her and the keys. The sound came out hesitant. At first, the room's acoustics were dry, the kind that swallowed emotion. But her hands remembered what her eyes never had. The rhythm, the weight, the pain buried inside each phrase. The piece built itself slowly, layer upon layer, like a wound retelling its story. By the third measure, she was inside it. Not just playing, but reliving. Her fingers didn't just move. They fought. They clung. They sobbed through chords and whispered through diminuendos. Each strike on the low register felt like a door slammed shut in her past. Each high note like breath escaping someone who had tried to stay quiet for too long. The man in the cardigan didn't shift. He made no notes, no expressions. He looked at his phone once, checking the time. When she finished, she held the final note as long as it would breathe. Then she released it slowly, like letting go of something personal. She turned her head toward the judge, waiting. Not for praise, not even for acknowledgement. He simply stood, nodded once, and said, "Okay. Thank you," then walked out of the room. That was it. No comment on her technique. No questions. No questions about how a blind girl without access to a piano like the others had memorized one of the most demanding preludes in classical repertoire. She sat still for a long moment, hands resting on her lap. Her throat was tight. She wasn't sure why. She didn't cry. She just stood, grabbed her cane, and left the room, the way she came quietly, without making a sound. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that someone else had been in the room. A janitor, Mr. Ellis. 64 years old, worked at Crown Ridge for 18 years. He came in early every Friday to mop the upper rehearsal wing. He usually listened to gospel on his headphones, but that morning he'd forgotten to charge them. He'd opened the door to room B7, just a crack broom in hand, intending to return later. But the moment he heard the music, he froze. He'd never heard a student play like that. Not in that room, not with that piano. He took out his phone. Not to film her face, he wouldn't disrespect her like that, but to catch the sound. Just 30 seconds. He didn't know her name. He didn't even know she was blind. All he knew was that for those few minutes, the old Yamaha, usually ignored, usually unloved, had been turned into something sacred. When she left the room, he stepped aside quietly, letting her pass. She didn't notice him. She didn't know he'd been crying. Later that day, Zariah sat on her bed in the dormitory, hands folded over her knees. She hadn't told anyone about the audition, not even the other silent observers. Franklin hadn't called. No email had come. She lay back on her mattress and stared at the ceiling, pointed her face toward it. There was no real staring in her world, only sensing. Her fingers still felt the keys, but in her chest she felt nothing. Not pride, not pain, just a space. Like she'd tried to speak, and the world had turned its back. In a storage room next to the janitor's closet, Mr. Ellis uploaded the video clip to an old YouTube channel he'd used once to post his grandson's talent show. He didn't write a long title. Just 4 words, blind girl, Rachmaninoff, heart. Then he put his phone away and whispered, "Lord, don't let them miss this again." It took 2 days for the video to break 1,000 views. Mr. Ellis never expected more. He didn't even check his phone again until Monday. When he opened YouTube to play a gospel track on his break, the number next to the video had jumped. 30,000. He blinked, refreshed the page. 56,000. Comments were pouring in. "Who is this girl? I've never cried from a piano piece before. Where can I find more?" One comment, written by someone named @Aria from Paris, said, "This is music that was never written, only remembered." Zaria didn't know. She still showed up to Crown Ridge's empty practice halls, still sat in the hallway outside room 2C with her fingers floating in the air. Franklin hadn't told her yet, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew what it would mean. He'd seen too many kids destroyed by the weight of sudden attention, and Zariah wasn't built like the others. She didn't have a safety net, no parents to manage her image, no publicist to run interference, but it didn't matter. The internet had made its decision. By day 4, the video hit 200,000. By day 5, it was re-uploaded by a French music blog. The headline read, "A blind American girl plays Rachmaninoff from memory and the world stops." That blog had a following: musicians, critics, even conductors. That's when it reached the inbox of a man named Gerard Rousseau, the artistic director of the Global Music Gala. Rousseau was a traditionalist, a perfectionist. He'd spent his life curating the finest musicians for the most prestigious stage on earth, the Royal Palais Theatre in Vienna. The gala was broadcast in 72 countries. Tickets cost more than most people's rent. The lineup had already been finalized: 12 performers, 10 of them prodigies with recording deals. One of them headlining the closing segment was Lionel Hargrave, but Rousseau couldn't stop watching the clip. He forwarded it to his assistant with a one-line message: "Find her." 2 days later, Zariah was eating breakfast alone in the conservatory's cafeteria, just toast, no butter, when Franklin walked in with an envelope. He slid it across the table. "You won't believe this," he said, voice tight. She frowned. "What is it?" "You've been invited to open the Global Music Gala." She didn't move, didn't even breathe. "What?" she whispered. He sat across from her, eyes searching hers. "They want you to perform. You, by name, on the stage in Vienna." Her fingers twitched. The toast in her hand slipped onto the tray. I don't understand. They saw the video, he said. All of them. Rousseau, the gala committee, half the internet. She stayed quiet. Her breath caught in her throat. They want me to open, she said again, like she needed to hear it a second time. Franklin nodded. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, and slowly she pressed her hand flat against the table, grounding herself. Her mind flashed back to the moment in room B7 where she'd sat alone in the dark and played into nothing. That moment wasn't forgotten anymore. Backstage, Hargrave was livid. You can't be serious, he told Rousseau over the phone. She's a child, blind, untrained. This is politics. This is music, Rousseau said coldly. The world wants to hear her. I refuse to follow her set, Hargrave snapped. I headline. You'll perform when scheduled, Rousseau replied. This is not your concert. Hargrave gritted his teeth and hung up. He stared at his calendar, jaw, tight hands shaking slightly. Something was shifting, and for the first time in years, he didn't control it. When Zaria arrived in Vienna, she didn't carry a wardrobe case or security entourage, just one suitcase and her cane. Franklin walked beside her through the gilded entrance of the Palais Theater. The staff nodded as they passed. Some even smiled. A woman from the committee offered her a hand. We're honored to have you here, Miss Cole. Zaria blinked in the direction of the voice. Thank you, she said softly. I'm honored too. In her dressing room, there were flowers so many she couldn't walk 2 steps without brushing petals. She didn't smile, not because she wasn't grateful, but because a part of her still didn't believe it. The night before the show, Franklin found her sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. The lights were off. The window was open. She was silent. You okay? He asked. She nodded, then shook her head. He sat next to her. I'm not scared, she said finally. Just trying to remember who I am before the lights turn on. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, You're the same girl who played Rachmaninoff in an empty room with no one watching. That's who you are. She turned toward him, her voice low. And now they're all watching. He nodded. Yes, but they're not watching because someone told them to. They're watching because you made them stop. For the first time, Zaria wasn't pushed off the stage. She was invited to walk onto it by name. Her name was printed on the program. Her seat was at the front. Her dressing room had a nameplate. Her rehearsal slot was 7:00 p.m. prime time. Everything about her presence said, she belongs here. And as she sat at the piano, during sound check fingertips grazing the Steinway's polished surface, she whispered to herself, You hear me now. The rehearsal room wasn't just large, it was massive. Palais Garnier's side hall had ceilings high enough to swallow the sound of an entire orchestra and still leave space for echoes. At the center of the stage stood a Steinway D concert grand, its black lacquer surface glowing under the warm rehearsal lights. The instrument had played under the hands of legends, but never for a girl like Zaria Cole. She walked in slowly, wearing a simple gray sweater and a black wool skirt that brushed the tops of her shoes. No makeup, no assistant. Just her cane tapping across the stage as she counted her steps, her left hand brushing the edge of the piano to orient herself. From the side, Lionel Hargrave watched with a paper cup of espresso in hand. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, face unreadable. His eyes followed her like a hawk's, but his mouth twisted slightly, half annoyance, half curiosity. Zaria paused once she found the bench. She lowered herself carefully, placed her cane on the ground beside her, and exhaled. She didn't look around, didn't ask for instructions. The room was filled with lighting technicians, audio engineers, and a stage manager holding a clipboard. Everyone was quiet, waiting to see what she would do. She didn't play. Not at first. Instead, she sat with her hands in her lap, eyes closed, breathing steady. For 30 full seconds, no one moved. The silence stretched too long for comfort. Someone at the back shifted on their feet. One of the sound crew whispered, Is she waiting for a cue? Franklin Dare stood in the wings, calm. No, he said. She's listening. Zaria reached out. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, never touching, just floating like she was feeling for heat. Her brows tensed slightly, and for a moment it seemed she might pull away. Then her hands fell. A single G. Soft. Barely audible. It rang out like a question in an empty church. The room froze. She followed it with silence again. Longer this time. The kind of silence you could feel behind your ribs. Then her right hand moved into motion. Not with a prepared piece. Not a single sheet of music in front of her. No patterns. No predictable bars. It was raw. Unwritten. The melody came slow, unfamiliar, fractured, then suddenly whole. A ripple of notes descending into minor intervals, then lifting again, like they'd remembered something important and didn't want to let go. The left hand joined after a full minute, not matching the rhythm, but responding to it, like two voices arguing, reconciling, then grieving together. She leaned slightly forward, her whole body aligned with the motion of the sound. She wasn't playing notes, she was pulling them from somewhere deeper. Not memory, not theory, something older than both. One of the lighting techs who had worked the gala for 16 years slowly removed his headset and stepped down from his post. Nobody asked why. Even Hargrave arms still folded stopped mid-sip, his brow furrowed. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the sound itself, or the fact that he couldn't anticipate where it was going. His brain searched for structure, but there was none. Just feeling. "She's not reading," he muttered. "Not even muscle memory." Franklin, overhearing, replied without turning. "No, she doesn't remember the music. She becomes it." A technician nearby whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." Another added, "You can't teach this. You can't even fake it." Zaria's hands picked up speed, then abruptly stopped mid-chord. Her fingers hovered over the keys, frozen. The last notes hung in the air like they were scared to fall. She didn't close the piece. She didn't resolve the melody. She simply lifted her hands and placed them in her lap, face expressionless, breathing calm. Nobody clapped, nobody spoke. She waited a beat longer, then turned her face slightly toward the side of the stage. "That was just warm-up," she said softly. A sound technician dropped his pen. Hargrave stepped back. His jaw tightened. He didn't say anything, but in his eyes, something cracked. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. He had spent decades chasing perfection. Zaria had just shattered it with one unfinished idea. And she didn't even call it music. She called it preparation. As she stood up, picked up her cane, and walked off stage, the stage manager finally remembered to breathe. He clicked his pen 3 times, unsure what to write. Franklin met her at the exit, hand out. "How do you feel?" She gave the faintest shrug. "Still listening." The Palais Garnier never looked more golden. The chandeliers burned like fire caught in crystal. Every seat in the legendary Golden Aria Hall had been claimed royalty in the front rows, ambassadors along the side aisles, music critics with open notebooks under their laps, and cameras from 50 networks discreetly tucked into marble ledges. The red velvet curtains had been steam-pressed hours before. Even the air seemed rehearsed. Backstage, Zaria Cole sat still. No entourage, no mirror. Her dress was simple black matte and fitted just enough to let her move without stepping on the hem. She wore no jewelry, no shoes. Her feet were bare, grounded. Her cane rested beside her. One hand gently held the wrist of the other fingertips, brushing the tiny silk tassel Franklin had sewn on for luck. Across from her, Professor Franklin Dare paced once, then twice, then stopped. "You don't have to look at them," he said gently. She turned her face toward his voice. "I can't," she replied. He chuckled, breath-catching. "Fair point." A knock came at the door. "Miss Cole," a woman called softly. "You're on in 5. Zaria inhaled through her nose, exhaled. "Okay." Franklin stepped forward. "Do you want me to walk you out?" She stood slowly, reaching for his arm. "Only until I sit." "Of course." They walked together through the narrow corridor, one slow step at a time. Her cane tapped against the old marble as they turned the final corner. From the other side of the stage curtain, a voice echoed out over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we open this year's Global Gala with a debut performance from a pianist whose name just weeks ago the world had never heard. Tonight you will not hear a piece from the classical canon. You will hear something else, something that belongs only to this moment. Please welcome Zaria Cole." The crowd applauded politely at first, then with rising curiosity, then silence again. The curtain parted. Zaria emerged slowly barefoot, her left hand lightly gripping Franklin's forearm. She walked in rhythm with her own breath, each step careful but not hesitant. Her chin was up, her shoulders square. No one whispered, no one coughed. She reached the piano bench, felt the edge with her fingertips, and sat. Franklin stepped back into the shadow. Zaria sat alone beneath the golden light. She didn't move. Not yet. Her hands remained in her lap, her head tilted down, not as submission, but as preparation. The hall was so quiet it felt like no one was breathing. Even in the balcony, people leaned forward, trying to make out the shape of her stillness. Then her hands rose. They hovered above the keys, not like a performer waiting for applause to fade, but like someone reaching into something invisible. And then, finally, she played. But it wasn't a prelude. It wasn't Beethoven or Chopin. It wasn't anything the audience recognized. It was her. The right hand came first, fragile notes, sparse and tremulous, as if they were feeling their way forward. They repeated, then shifted, forming a melody that felt hesitant and childlike. Then the left hand entered not in rhythm, but as anchor. Heavy chords, low, rich, slow. Zariah's body moved with the music not dramatically, but in pulses. Her breath changed tempo with the notes. Her brow furrowed on certain passages. Her mouth parted on others. The music swelled, building on itself pattern by pattern, sometimes dissonant, sometimes oddly soothing. A tension existed between her hands as if one held memory and the other fought against it. An ambassador's wife in the third row wiped her eyes without realizing it. A young violinist in the upper balcony leaned forward so far his glasses slipped from his lap and clattered to the floor. No one shushed him. They were all inside it. Zariah's tempo changed again, rising now. The chords thickened, her shoulders tensed, her head tilted up as if the notes were lifting her by the chest. Then it broke, a sudden shift into minor, harsh strikes, like fists against locked doors. Her entire body pressed into the keys, back-arched wrists flexed as if she were pouring out something that had no language. Then stillness, a single note, held, drawn out, then a pause. And in that pause, every person in the room felt something loosen. Hargrave, watching from the green room on a live monitor, stood frozen. His coffee sat untouched, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wet. He had never played like that. Not once, not even close. Zariah resumed with a melody in E major, simple, wistful. Just the right hand now. A short sequence repeated each time, just slightly different. A missing note here, a longer pause there, then a drop, a slide. Those who had grown up with lullabies recognized it instantly. Not a song they knew, but something that felt like one. It was the sound of being rocked to sleep, of someone humming while folding laundry, of a mother's voice that lived only in memory. People in the audience began to cry, not from sadness, but recognition. Zariah let the last phrase ring out, barely touching the keys. Then she lifted her hands, slowly, like letting go of something sacred. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She sat, her head tilted slightly as if listening not to them, but to what she had just left in the air. Then she stood, placed her hand gently on the edge of the bench, and began to walk off stage. That's when it happened. The silence broke, not with polite applause, with thunder. A standing ovation so loud it shook the hall. Chairs scraped, people cried out. Someone shouted her name. Zariah paused just at the curtain's edge and turned her head, not fully, just enough to acknowledge it had reached her. Then she disappeared behind the velvet, swallowed by the wings. Hargrave sat down. His hands trembled. He said to no one, "They won't remember me tonight. They'll remember her." And he was right. That night, headlines across the world read, "She played 5 minutes." The world stopped for 10. That night, a child in Detroit hummed the melody from the stream and asked her mother, "Can I learn piano too?" That night, a man in Tokyo who hadn't spoken to his daughter in years called just to say, "Did you hear that girl play?" That night, the world didn't just hear Zariah Cole. It listened, and it didn't move. At 5:42 a.m., the first headline dropped. Blind Girl Shatters Gala Expectations Leaves Hall in Tears. By 6:30 a.m., the performance video had been clipped, captioned, and reposted on 4 continents. By 9:00 a.m., it hit 10 million views. By noon, 50 million. But Zariah Cole didn't know any of that. She was sitting barefoot on the windowsill of her modest Paris hotel room, listening to the sound of early streetcars and the low hum of rain against stone. Franklin sat across the room at a tiny desk pouring tea into 2 ceramic cups. He didn't check his phone. He didn't need to. It had been vibrating since dawn. Someone from Berlin Conservatory wrote, he said softly, "They want to offer you a full residency, with a stipend, housing, studio time." She turned her face slightly toward him, but didn't answer. He cleared his throat. A record label sent an offer too. 6-figure advance, global distribution, nothing. He leaned back. "Another one wants you for a 10-city tour. All expenses covered. They say you can choose your own repertoire." She exhaled slowly, resting her chin on her knees. He waited. After a minute, she said, "They want me to play songs I haven't lived." Franklin looked down at the steam curling off his tea. "Yes, they do." She turned away from the window and stood up. Her movements were slow but decisive. She walked over to the chair where her suitcase sat, opened it quietly, and placed inside a folded sweater, her cane, and a manuscript. Not a full composition, just sketches, fragments of melody, bits of rhythm she'd collected over the past few weeks. "You're really not going to respond?" he asked. Zariah closed the suitcase. They heard what they needed to hear. "But they want more. They want product," she said. "I gave them truth." Franklin didn't argue. He knew she was right. At Gala, headquarters calls flooded in. Streaming companies, news anchors, social media managers, music historians, foundations, and former politicians. Everyone wanted a piece of her. Some wanted interviews. Others wanted licensing rights. One agency even offered to send a team to craft her brand. The Gala's PR coordinator leaned back in her chair, blinking at the monitor. "We've never seen numbers like this," she murmured. "Never." Another staffer walked in breathless. "Zaria Cole is trending in 48 countries. The PR director looked up. "And she hasn't posted a thing, no. No socials, no agent, no public email." She stood, grabbed her blazer. "We need to find her." But by the time they got a car to the hotel, Zariah and Franklin were gone. No forward address, no forwarding number, just the memory of what had happened the night before. In the days that followed, media outlets did what they do best, they speculated. Is she rejecting fame? Does she have a hidden team? Is she anti-establishment or just overwhelmed on podcasts? Commentators tried to decode her silence. On TV, retired musicians offered long-winded interpretations. But the truth was simple. She had left, by choice, and no one could follow. In a small countryside inn outside Lyon, Zariah and Franklin unpacked quietly. The room was nothing fancy. Wooden floors, a small desk, a balcony facing a narrow river. Franklin watched her as she moved through the space, silent, calm, deliberate. "You know," he said finally, "when I was your age, all I wanted was to be seen. I would have given anything to be heard like that." Zariah sat on the floor near the window, her back against the frame. "I wasn't born to be seen," she said. "I was born to listen." He smiled, but his throat tightened. "And now the world's listening back." She didn't smile, but she nodded. The offers kept coming. Prestigious invitations, large sums. One letter arrived handwritten from a royal court in the Middle East requesting a private audience. Another came from an international peace organization nominating her for a humanitarian award. She ignored them all. To the outside world, it looked like rebellion, a New Age statement. But to her, it wasn't complicated. They didn't want her. They wanted the moment. And Zariah wasn't interested in being a moment. She was interested in being real. In a cafe in Lisbon, two students watched the replay of her performance on a cracked iPad. One of them leaned in and whispered, "She didn't even bow." The other replied she didn't have to. In Johannesburg, a blind teenage girl sat at a school piano for the first time. In Baltimore, a music teacher rewrote her curriculum to include improvisation and emotion. In Seoul, a choir held a moment of silence before rehearsal and asked each singer to recall what the performance meant to them. People weren't copying her music, they were copying her presence. Somewhere along the French countryside, Franklin handed her another envelope. "From the American Chamber of Composers. They're offering to name a fellowship after you." She opened it slowly, read the letter once, folded it back. "What should I say?" he asked. Zariah thought for a moment. "Tell them I'm not finished becoming me yet." By the end of the second week, the industry stopped trying to reach her, not because they lost interest, but because they understood. She wasn't gone. She was choosing her own rhythm. And the world, for once, didn't rush to fill the silence she left behind, because in that silence, people heard themselves. It had been 7 weeks since the night the world heard Zariah Cole. No new posts, no performances, no interviews. Some assumed she'd vanished. Others thought it was a strategy. But those who truly understood her knew better. Zariah didn't vanish. She moved toward the quiet. In a remote corner of Ghana, far from the concert halls and camera crews, a small orphanage sat at the edge of a dirt road. Tin roofs, peeling walls, wooden shutters that creaked with every breeze. Inside, children played with broken toys and sang made-up songs to pass time between meals. That was where Zariah showed up. No press, no fanfare. Just her Franklin and a weather-worn keyboard they'd carried on the roof of a bus for 6 hours. The orphanage director, a kind man with tired eyes named Joseph, met them at the front gate. He looked at her, then down at her bare feet in the red dust. "You are Miss Cole?" he asked cautiously. Zariah gave a small nod. Joseph blinked, visibly stunned. "I thought it was a joke. The letter had no return address." "I don't use one," she replied calmly. He stepped aside. "Come in, please." Inside the main room, a boy named Kwame sat in a wheelchair by the window, a broken toy trumpet resting in his lap. He was born with spinal bifida. The other kids called him Stick Boy. Most days he didn't speak, just looked out toward the road listening to cars he couldn't chase. Zariah approached him, slowly lowered herself to the floor, and said nothing. Kwame glanced sideways but didn't turn his head. She placed the keyboard on the ground, connected a small speaker, then pressed one key, middle C. It made a soft beep. She didn't play a melody. She turned to him and asked, "Can you feel that in your foot?" Kwame blinked, then nodded. "Try this one," she said, playing an F. He looked confused. She touched his ankle gently. "Tap if you feel it." Another note. He tapped twice. Then she smiled. "That's rhythm," she said. "And that means you already know how to begin." For the next hour, she taught him how to play with his feet. Not because it was inspiring, because it was possible. By sunset, he'd composed 4 notes of his own. By the next morning, he had 6. When she asked him what he wanted to call the song, he said quietly, "I don't know. I've never named anything." She replied, "Then just call it yours." A week later, Zaria visited a nursing home outside Marseille. It wasn't fancy. The floors creaked. The nurses were overworked. Most of the patients didn't get visitors. She asked the staff not to gather everyone. "I just want to play in the hallway," she said. They didn't understand, but they agreed. So she sat outside the rooms. No microphone, no set list. She played slow pieces, simple, low-tempo melodies. Some were soft lullabies. Others were just sequences of 3 or 4 notes repeated gently. In room 11, a woman who hadn't slept through the night in 2 years finally drifted off. In room 6, a former soldier with dementia began humming along. No one clapped, no one recorded, but a nurse, wiping her eyes between rounds, whispered to Franklin, "She doesn't just play to them. She listens for what they can't say." And then came the letters. They didn't come in piles. They came quietly, one at a time. Some written in crayon, some typed with trembling hands, some dictated by people who couldn't hold a pen. Each one told a story, a confession, a plea. Zariah read them in silence. Then she sat down and wrote back, not with words, but with music. She didn't send thank you cards. She sent melodies, short hand-scored pieces. No duplicates, no recordings, no archive. Each piece was wrapped in paper, sometimes with Braille labels, sometimes with just a line like, "For the father who never came home," "For the girl who stopped talking after 3rd grade," "For the man who said goodbye before he could say sorry." She never told anyone she was doing it, not even Franklin. He only found out after discovering a stack of envelopes, each labeled with initials he didn't recognize. "Why don't you keep a copy?" he asked one evening. Zariah looked up from her desk. "Because they're not mine once I finish them." In a community clinic in Chicago, a woman who had survived a domestic violence shelter opened her mailbox and found a small envelope. Inside was a single-page score. The melody was only 22 seconds long. When she played it on an old Casio keyboard, she wept for the first time in 6 years. In a prison in New Mexico, a man who'd written to Zariah about the son he lost at birth received a handwritten note. No return address, no explanation, just a piece of music titled "Forgiven Tempo." He played it every night on the facility's shared piano. Even the guards stopped to listen. The world still called her a genius. But Zariah never responded to praise. She didn't ignore it. She just didn't need it. Because for her, music was never about applause. It was about presence, connection, repair. And in the quiet corners of the world where pain lived in silence, Zariah gave people something to hold on to. Not perfection, not salvation, just the chance to feel worth it again. They called it a movement, though no one could name the day it began. There was no press release, no televised announcement, no celebrity endorsement. It started quietly. In a music school in Sao Paulo, Brazil, an instructor named Luana rearranged her classroom. She removed the desks and replaced them with cushions. At the door, she posted a handwritten sign, "Play like Zariah." Inside, children of all abilities sat in a circle, some with instruments, some with nothing but their breath and a will to learn. One boy had lost both arms in an accident. She taught him to tap rhythm with his feet. Another girl couldn't read music, but could mimic tone by humming. Luana didn't teach them Mozart or scales. She taught them to listen. Feel first, she'd say, then play. By the end of the semester, they'd composed their own suite titled "For the Sounds No One Heard." In Johannesburg, a retired saxophonist named Themba reopened an abandoned warehouse on the city's edge. With the help of a local youth center, he filled it with donated keyboards, secondhand drums, and reclaimed furniture. They called the space the listening room. The rules were simple: no auditions, no sheet music required, no talking over someone else's silence. One evening, a blind girl named Empho, no older than 10, walked in with her older brother. She had never touched a piano before. Within an hour, she was building a melody from nothing but heartbeat and breath. Themba cried when she finished. She played like she'd been waiting her whole life to be asked, he whispered. Across the world, more spaces appeared. In small towns and big cities, in community centers and church basements. People called the initiative by different names. The Zariah Method Silent String Soul. First, but most stuck to one simple phrase: play like Zariah. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a philosophy. You didn't need sight, or fingers, or a music degree. You needed honesty. At the Conservatory of London, the very school that once kept Zariah in the hallway, a student-led petition forced the administration to re-examine its admission policies. Within a year, the school introduced an entire division for non-traditional learners. Applicants were now allowed to submit recordings, tactile compositions, or even audio interviews in place of standard notation. Braille sheet music sales surged globally. For the first time in the conservatory's history, entrance exams were translated into 5 accessibility formats. A former board member was heard saying, "She didn't kick down the door. She simply played so beautifully that we had to open it ourselves." In Portland, Oregon, a high school music teacher named Carl Alvarez redesigned his curriculum. Instead of teaching students to memorize scales, he handed out envelopes. Inside each was a real letter written by someone around the world who had once written to Zariah. One read, "I lost my son. I want to learn how to hear again." Another, "I used to hum to my grandmother before she died. I want to remember what her voice felt like." The students were told to write music back. Not polished songs, just sound, honest sound. A student with autism composed a 1-minute piece made entirely of soft taps on a water glass. A shy trumpet player wrote 4 notes that repeated like a heartbeat rising in pitch until it felt like a goodbye. By the final week, Carl removed the whiteboard and replaced it with a sentence written in chalk. Music is not about being heard. It's about making someone feel seen. When journalists asked why this all happened, no one could answer the same way. Some credited the viral video. Others cited her silence as the catalyst. But those who had truly listened, who had really let her music into their bones, said something else. She didn't change the world by force. She reminded the world that it already wanted to change. Franklin Dare heard about it all secondhand. He didn't follow the news, but letters still found their way to him, some from teachers, some from parents, some from children who had never seen a concert hall. He kept them in a small wooden box. Once a week, he would take a few to Zariah and read them aloud. One afternoon, he read a message from a 10-year-old boy in Malaysia. The boy had 1 leg and no fingers. He'd built a drum from bottle caps and twine. He wrote, "I don't play music like normal kids, but when I hit it, my mom says she can breathe again." Zariah sat quietly on the porch of a small cabin nestled near the woods. She rocked gently in her chair, listening to the trees. When Franklin finished reading, she smiled faintly. She hears him. She said, and that was enough. She never returned to the global stage. She didn't need to. Her fingerprints were now everywhere, not in autographs, but in the way music was being taught, shared, and reimagined. She wasn't a celebrity. She was a reminder. That being heard was never about volume. It was about truth. And the world, at least part of it, had started telling the truth again. The Royal Chamber Hall of London had never looked more immaculate. The gold trim along the balcony railings shimmered under soft amber lights. Every seat was filled. Diplomats, composers, journalists, and international arts ministers had flown in from over 50 countries for the annual Artisan Honor Ceremony, a night meant to celebrate the finest contributions to music in the world. This year, there was only one name whispered in the corridors before the show began: Zaria Cole. Her name was on the official program. The Artisan Honor, the highest global recognition given to a musician once every 10 years, was to be presented to her. The world had waited months for this moment, and yet Zariah hadn't responded to the foundation's emails, or the press, or the invitations. It wasn't until 2 days before the event that a courier arrived at the foundation's office with a single note, handwritten in black ink: "I will attend. I will not speak." There was no signature, but they knew. Backstage organizers reviewed the script again and again. The MC, a polished tenor with BBC diction, rehearsed the lines. "What do I say if she refuses to come up?" he asked. You don't, the director replied. You wait, and let her choose. Meanwhile, out in the hall, Zaria sat in the 5th row, from the back, far from the spotlight. She wore a charcoal gray dress that fell just below her knees. Her feet were bare. Beside her sat Professor Franklin Dare, holding the same wooden cane she'd used since she was a teenager. As guests filed in, some turned surprised to see her sitting among them instead of in the front row or backstage. A few whispered, a few tried to approach. But one look from Franklin's steady eyes was enough to remind them this wasn't the time. Zaria sat with her hands folded in her lap, her chin slightly lowered, her body completely still, but her ears were alive. She listened to the rustle of programs, the quiet hum of stage lights, the tension in people's breaths. She was never nervous before moments like this, because this wasn't a performance, it was presence. At exactly 8 o'clock, the room dimmed. The MC stepped forward, center stage voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor not only a musician, but a turning point in music itself. The Artisan Honor is not an award given lightly. It is a recognition of transformation of a sound that became a movement, and a movement that became a mirror. He paused. The silence in the room deepened. This year's recipient is someone who never auditioned for our attention. She never chased fame. She didn't need to. Her honesty did the chasing for her. He turned toward the side wall where a spotlight gently illuminated the 5th row. Zaria Cole. No music played, no spotlight swung to the stage, just the quiet sound of an entire hall standing at once. Rows of people rose slowly, one after another, heads bowed, eyes full, not out of tradition, but reverence. Some clapped, but only briefly, then hands lowered, almost ashamed to break the silence. Zaria didn't stand. She didn't wave. She reached down to a cloth-wrapped case beneath her seat and pulled out a wooden flute, aged simple, with a soft etching near the base. It had once belonged to her mother. She unwrapped it, slowly brought it to her lips and played. No introduction, no mic, just breath. The first note was gentle, thin, almost trembling. It floated above the rows like a question. Then came another, then two. The melody didn't follow structure. It wasn't familiar. It was built in real time, from memory, from silence, from something no one else could reach, but everyone could feel. Each phrase seemed to ask, can you still hear the quiet part of yourself? The audience didn't move. Some closed their eyes. Some wept. The piece lasted only 3 minutes, but no one spoke when it ended. Zaria lowered the flute. Her hands remained still. The hall remained still. There was no applause, not because it wasn't deserved, because it didn't feel right to interrupt what had just happened. The MC, still frozen in place, gently stepped back into the wings. No one read from the script again. No one dared. Outside, the air was crisp. A soft drizzle misted over the streetlights as guests began to exit in hushed conversation. No one argued over taxis. No one checked their phones. Something had shifted. Inside, Zaria and Franklin remained seated, long after the crowd had left. You didn't even look at the stage, he said softly. I didn't need to, she replied. He smiled. They'll never forget it. She leaned back her fingers, tracing the flute's edge. They weren't supposed to remember me. Just the silence. He looked at her. And what did you hear? Zaria paused. Peace, for the first time in a long time. Across the city, news anchors tried to explain what had happened. None could. No statement had been given, no photo op arranged. But the moment rippled. People wrote about it online. They didn't talk about the honor itself. They talked about what it felt like to sit in a room where no one wanted to be louder than the music. In a bar in Dublin, a cellist who had stopped playing years ago picked up his bow again. In a hospital in Jakarta, a nurse streamed the audio recording of Zaria's flute for her dying patient's final hour. In Los Angeles, a teenager who'd never believed she had a voice began writing her first song, not to sell, but to speak. That night, Zaria didn't stay at a luxury hotel. She returned to a quiet flat above a small bakery run by an old friend of Franklin's. Before bed, she folded the cloth around her flute, tied the edges, and placed it near the window. She didn't look out. She didn't need to see the stars. She had already heard them. They used to wonder where she went. After the Artisan Honor night search, traffic surged. Where is Zaria now? Will she tour again? Is she teaching somewhere? But like always, she gave no answers. No interviews, no posts. Just disappeared. Except she hadn't. She had moved where noise didn't follow. In a refugee camp in southern Turkey, on a windy afternoon, a doctor stepped out of a tent and heard something strange. A rhythm, not music, Not at first. Just footsteps, then soft claps, then something like a heartbeat. He turned the corner and saw her Zariah sitting in the dirt with 5 children. One of them tapped a plastic jug with a spoon. Another stomped in a steady pattern. Zariah nodded along, then reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a torn piece of cardboard. She laid it flat and tapped gently with her fingertips. No one else would have called it music, but they didn't need to. The children began to smile. One girl, no older than 7, closed her eyes and swayed. A boy missing 2 fingers tried to copy the beat using the side of his palm. Zariah leaned in and whispered, "Yes, that's it. It's not about how many notes. It's about what you mean with them." She stayed until dusk, then disappeared again before sunrise. 2 weeks later, a monk in a remote temple near Chiang Rai posted a blurry photo to his personal page. The caption read, "A woman with no shoes played Wind Through Our Walls. She had arrived with no luggage, just a flute tied to her back with a strip of faded cloth." He said she listened more than she spoke, listened to the temple bells, the crack of bamboo in the wind, the soft drag of sandals on the stone floor. Then she taught 3 monks to hum in a pattern that matched the drip of water in the meditation pond. It was not music, he wrote, it was memory. And again she left without farewell. In a bus station on the outskirts of Bogotá, a teenage boy sat on a bench crying into his sleeve. He had been on the street for nearly a year. His name was Luis. He didn't speak much, never did, but he had a tin can he drummed on with 2 spoons when he felt too overwhelmed to scream. One evening, Zariah sat beside him without a word. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't touch him. She tapped twice on the bench. He stopped crying, looked up, and tapped back. 2 taps. Then 1. Then silence. She nodded. "That's a good start." He stared at her confused. She picked up the tin, flipped it gently, and tapped 3 soft notes with her fingernail, then handed it back to him. "Now you try." He did. 1 note, then 2, then the same 3 she showed him. She smiled. "That's yours now." Months later, that same rhythm, those 5 notes, were used as the opening sound for an international mental health campaign for street youth. The footage featured no branding, just the tin can. The campaign was titled "Listen Back." They never mentioned her name, but those who knew, knew. In Nairobi, at a clinic for trauma survivors, a volunteer named Esther described a session where a group of women were too afraid to speak. Zariah had entered quietly, sat on the floor, and began to tap the heartbeat rhythm. 2 beats pause, 2 beats pause. One by one the women joined. Not with words, with fingers, with footsteps. One woman tapped her ring against her water bottle. Another scraped her chair back and forth softly like waves. It became a symphony of survival built from silence and fear, turned into something human again. Esther cried after. "She didn't teach us music," she said. "She taught us how to hear each other again." Zariah didn't stay long in any one place, but wherever she went, things changed. Not in headlines, but in habits. In Mumbai, a school for deaf children introduced a class called vibration composition. In Warsaw, a cafe hung a sign over its open mic night. "You don't need to be trained. You need to be true." In New Orleans, a 2nd-grade teacher rewrote her entire music curriculum based on the way Zariah worked. Each student was assigned to listen for something outside of music and bring it back as a rhythm. One girl came back with the pulse of her dog's tail wagging. A boy brought the sound of his dad's laugh. The classroom didn't just sing anymore. They understood each other. Back in the outskirts of Florence, in a quiet garden where the wind bent low through cypress trees, Franklin sat on a stone bench reading another letter. It came from a young man in Morocco. "I was never musical. I thought music belonged to people with skill, with money. But now I listen to the wind against the mountains. And I hear her." He folded the letter, looked at Zariah sitting nearby with her eyes closed and flute resting in her lap. "You hear that?" he asked. "They're not talking about your notes anymore." Zariah nodded slowly. "They're talking about each other." He exhaled deeply, then said, "You've become something else now. You know that, right?" She smiled faintly. That was never the goal. But it happened anyway. She didn't argue. She just leaned back, her palms pressed flat to the ground, and whispered, "It was never about being remembered. It was about remembering how to feel." And that's what the world started doing. People began building songs from footsteps, from laughter, from breath, from absence. They didn't try to recreate her. They tried to live like she showed them by listening first. Some say she's a ghost now, a myth, a legend with no official biography. But in the right places, when the lights are low, when no one's watching, when a child hums alone under the noise of the city, you can still hear her. not in the melody, but in the space between, not in the applause, but in the hush that follows. Because Zariah didn't teach the world how to make sound, she taught it how to receive it. She became the breath of music itself. And the music has never stopped breathing since. No one knew exactly when she vanished. There was no announcement, no farewell, no obituary. Just one day, the story stopped being about what she had done and started being about what others were doing because of her. Her name stopped appearing in headlines and instead appeared in journal entries, lesson plans, whispered conversations between parents and children who had once believed they weren't meant for music. Zariah didn't leave a legacy in museums or archives. She left it in the way people now looked at silence, not as absence, but as invitation. The last confirmed sighting was in a town nestled between two mountains in Slovenia. A bakery owner said she came in one evening soaked from a rainstorm, asked for a bowl of soup, and paid by tuning the upright piano in the corner with a butter knife and a string of dental floss. She played only for 5 minutes. A melody the owner couldn't describe, only that it made his wife, who had early Alzheimer's, turn toward him and say his name for the first time in months. She left before dawn. After that, there were no more photos, no more recordings, just echoes. One boy in a village library in Iceland claimed he found a melody folded into the back sleeve of a Braille music book. It had no title, just 7 notes and the initial ZC etched in the corner. A teacher in Morocco told a story of a girl who couldn't read, couldn't see, and had never touched an instrument, but when asked what music felt like, she said, "Like the way that woman made me breathe when she tapped my chest." In Tokyo, a child who had never spoken in public stepped on stage and played a 10-second piece using only the rhythm of his own heartbeat, and when asked where he learned that, he simply said, "She told me it was already inside me." In a prison yard in Ohio, 2 inmates tapped a pattern into the cement wall for months before one of them finally explained it was her rhythm, the one that made me stop thinking I was broken. And slowly across places Zariah never visited, or maybe had, people began to stop calling her an artist. They called her something else, a reason, a beginning, a mirror. She wasn't remembered for the songs she wrote, but for the questions she left behind. What if you didn't need to be gifted to make something beautiful? What if music didn't belong to the perfect but to the present? What if the best thing you could ever play was someone else's voice? Institutions changed without crediting her. Conservatories adjusted their curriculum. A music school in Copenhagen added a new prerequisite for admission, not reading sheet music, but describing how silence made you feel. In Brooklyn, an annual scholarship was awarded to a student who had never taken a single formal lesson. In Nairobi, a sign outside a community studio read, "We don't teach music, we unlock it." A movement started not in her name, but in her absence. One that made room for those who had been told, "Not you," and finally heard, "Why not you, Franklin Dare?" Now old and slower in step, once walked into a school in Vienna and heard a piece playing from the auditorium speakers. It was soft, gentle, a blend of breath and single notes on tin. It was not recorded. A student explained that every year during the first snowfall, the school played a melody inspired by the girl who didn't need to be seen to be felt. Franklin sat in the last row. He didn't say who he was. He didn't need to. He cried quietly the way someone cries when they realize their life's purpose wasn't just to teach a genius, but to protect a seed that changed the soil of the whole world. And so, Zariah became more than a musician. She became the reason someone in a bus station dared to tap a rhythm. The reason a child closed their eyes and thought, "I don't need to be like anyone else to belong here." She became the start of new stories, ones where children who were never picked for solos led entire rooms in wordless compositions, where elders who had forgotten their own names still remembered how a certain vibration felt against their palm, where parents finally understood that their child's silence wasn't emptiness, it was music waiting for someone to listen. She never built a foundation, never published a memoir, never headlined a world tour. She didn't need to, because the most permanent things are often the ones that can't be held. And her music wasn't something to hold. It was something to breathe, something to find again when the world got too loud, something to trust when words failed. No one marked her passing because there was nothing to mark. Only this one day, a young girl blind since birth found a recorder carved from driftwood resting in her school mailbox. No return address, no name, just a note that said, "Start where you are." Everything you need is already inside. The girl held it like it was sacred, and later that week she played 4 notes that made the teacher cry in the hallway. They say the best stories don't end, they just echo. Zariah was never trying to be great. She was trying to remind the world that it already was. And for those who once felt invisible, who once believed their voice wasn't enough, she gave them a gift no award could match permission to begin. The story of Zariah wasn't just about music. It was about reminding the world that every soul deserves to be heard, and every silence holds meaning. Her journey showed us that greatness doesn't come from applause, but from authenticity, from choosing to listen when the world shouts, from lifting others without needing to be lifted yourself. Zariah became a symbol, not because she wanted to be, but because she lived as proof that the smallest act of presence can inspire the greatest acts of change. And what about you? If you were in Zariah's place, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have played that first note? If this story moved you even just a little, don't forget to leave a comment below and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. And of course, subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you stories that heal, inspire, and remind us what truly matters. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.